In a galaxy where technology defines superiority and survival is a test of tools, one human is about to challenge everything an interstellar council believes about primitive life forms. "You've got to be kidding me," First Observer Korak chittered, their crystalline appendages clicking rapidly against the observation deck's control panel. "This has to be some sort of elaborate prank by the council. What seems to be the problem?" Third Observer Thal glided over, their bioluminescent tendrils pulsing with curiosity. They'd never seen their superior this agitated since that incident with the quantum coffee maker that gained sentience and tried to unionize the break room appliances. "Please, these humans," Observer Korak practically spat the word out like it was a particularly disagreeable piece of radioactive fungi. "The Council wants us to evaluate their emergency survival capabilities, and you won't believe what they consider the standard emergency kit." Observer Thal's tendrils dimmed slightly in confusion. Surely it can't be that bad. They've managed to achieve spaceflight, albeit rather crude by our standards. "See for yourself." Observer Korak projected the inventory list onto the main screen. No quantum stabilizers, no neural backup matrices, not even a basic molecular reconstructor. Just look at this primitive collection of items. The list floating before them read, water bottles, just plain H2O. Not even enriched with consciousness-expanding minerals. Dried food rations, no psychic enhancement compounds whatsoever. First aid kit contains actual thread for closing wounds. Flashlight powered by chemical batteries. Multi-tool, fire starter, emergency blanket, radio using electromagnetic waves, of all things. Oh my. Observer Thal's tendrils twisted it into what passed for a grimace in their species. "This is rather basic. Are we certain this isn't their children's training kit?" "That's the best part." Observer Korak's crystalline structure flickered with what might have been amusement or hysteria. It was always hard to tell with silicon-based life forms. "They expect fully grown adults to survive with these tools. The Council wants us to observe and document how they manage in survival situations with this collection of antiquated implements." At that moment, Second Observer Nizari materialized in the room, their quantum particles assembling themselves into their usual elegant cloud formation. "Are you two still going on about the human survival kits? Wait until you hear about the test subject they've assigned us." "Oh, do tell." Observer Thal's tendrils perked up with interest. Office gossip was universal across all species, after all. "Her name is Lieutenant Cass Alex Blackwood." Observer Nizari's particles swirled excitedly. "She's what they call a wilderness survival instructor in their military. Apparently, she once survived 3 weeks in something called the Australian Outback, with nothing but a knife and her uniform." "Australia?" Observer Korak pulled up the planetary database. "Ah, yes. That's the continent they used as a penal colony, the one where virtually every indigenous life form is capable of ending human existence in increasingly creative ways." "Precisely." Observer Nizari's cloud form condensed with satisfaction. "And get this, she volunteered for our observation program. Says she wants to show those alien folks what humans are made of." "How charmingly primitive," Observer Thal mused. "When do we begin?" The observation room sensors suddenly flared to life, bathing everything in a soft blue glow. "Right now, actually," Observer Korak announced. "Our subject has just been transported to the test environment, basic Class M planet, similar to Earth, but with 1.2 times the gravity and slightly higher oxygen content. We've dropped her in the equivalent of what humans would call wilderness." The main screen activated, showing a tall, athletic human female with close-cropped dark hair and weather-worn features. Lieutenant Winters was methodically checking her emergency kit, a slight smile playing on her lips as if she knew she was being watched. Did she just wave at the observation drone? Observer Thal's tendrils twisted in confusion. Impossible. Observer Korak dismissed. Our observation equipment is completely undetectable to human technology. Lieutenant Winters looked directly at the drone and winked. Well, Observer Nizari's particle cloud rippled with amusement. This should be interesting. The three observers watched as Cass shouldered her pathetically primitive emergency kit and started walking with purpose, already analyzing her surroundings. She moved with the confidence of someone who found themselves exactly where they wanted to be, which made absolutely no sense, given that she'd just been dropped on an alien planet with equipment that would make most spacefaring civilizations laugh themselves into a quantum singularity. I give her 3 rotations of this planet before she signals for extraction, Observer Korak declared confidently. Care to make that an official wager? Observer Nizari's particles arranged themselves into what passed for a smirk. You're on. The loser has to use the quantum coffee maker for a month. The one that still insists on discussing labor rights every time you try to get a beverage. The very same. Observer Thal's tendrils pulsed with amusement as they settled in to watch. Somehow they had a feeling this assignment was going to be far more entertaining than the standard observation rotation. Little did they know, Lieutenant Cass Winters was about to give them the show of their lives and challenge everything they thought they knew about primitive survival techniques. What in the name of the quantum collective is she doing now? Observer Korak's crystalline structure flickered with bewilderment. They'd been observing Lieutenant Winters for approximately 6 standard Earth hours, and nothing had gone according to their predictions. I believe, Observer Thal's tendrils twisted thoughtfully. She's making what humans call a shelter, though I must admit, her methodology is unexpected. On the screen, Cass was humming what sounded suspiciously like "Stayin' Alive," while efficiently weaving together large fronds from the local vegetation. She'd already constructed a raised platform using fallen branches and vines, positioning it between 2 trees with a view of both the nearby water source and the surrounding terrain. But that's not in the emergency manual. Observer Korak pulled up the standard human survival guidelines. The emergency blanket is supposed to be their primary shelter component. Oh, this is rich. Observer Nizari's particle cloud vibrated with amusement. Check the environmental readings. Observer Thal glanced at the data stream. Fascinating. She's positioned the shelter to take advantage of the prevailing winds for cooling, while the raised platform will protect against the planet's nocturnal predators. The woven fronds will provide better insulation than the emergency blanket alone, which she'll likely use as a moisture barrier. That's... Observer Korak's crystals turned a flustered shade of pink. That's actually quite clever. Want to call off the bet already? Observer Nizari teased. Absolutely not. She still has to survive the night cycle. And need I remind you about the... A bone-chilling shriek cut through the observation room's audio feed, causing all 3 aliens to instinctively shift into their defensive forms. On screen, Cass merely looked up from her work, raised an eyebrow, and muttered, "Well, hello to you too, gorgeous." What was that? Observer Thal's tendrils had wrapped themselves into tight coils. A local apex predator, Observer Nizari reported, their particles clustering anxiously. Similar to Earth's extinct terror birds, but with, extra appendages. They watched as Cass calmly reached into her kit and pulled out the multi-tool. With practiced efficiency, she began fashioning what appeared to be primitive weapons. A spear, several sharp stakes, and something involving vines and flexible branches that had Observer Korak's crystals vibrating with curiosity. Is she whistling? Observer Thal asked incredulously. Indeed, Lieutenant Winters had started whistling what their cultural database identified as an ancient Earth melody called Another One Bites the Dust, while setting up an intricate perimeter around her shelter. Fascinating defensive strategy, Observer Nizari noted, their particles arranging themselves into an analytical pattern. She's using the stakes as a primary barrier, but look at those vine constructions. They're trip alarms. If anything large approaches, she'll know exactly where it is. But how can she be so casual about it? QX Lithics demanded. She has to know about the predators. We specifically included that data in the planetary briefing. The answer came a few hours later during the planet's night cycle. The terror bird creature, standing nearly 4 meters tall with its auxiliary hunting limbs fully extended, thought it had detected easy prey. It stalked toward the elevated shelter, its needle-sharp beak gleaming in the light of the 3 moons. What happened next had all 3 observers metaphorically glued to their SAR screens. The predator triggered one of Cass's trip lines. Instead of panicking, she calmly rolled to a defensive position, spear in hand. The creature charged directly into a cleverly concealed pit trap that Cass had somehow found time to dig and disguise while they'd been discussing her shelter construction. Did she just... Observer Thal's tendrils were practically tied in knots. She did, Observer Nizari confirmed, their particle cloud expanding with excitement. She used the creature's momentum against it. Basic physics, no technology required. But that's not the best part, Observer Thal pointed out. Look at what she's doing now. Lieutenant Winters had descended from her shelter and was approaching the trapped creature with slow, deliberate movements. Instead of finishing it off, she was talking to it. Easy there, big fella. Her voice came clearly through their audio feed. That's quite a set of legs you've got there. Tell you what, I'm going to help you out of this hole, and in return, you're going to find somewhere else to hunt. Deal? She can't possibly think it understands her, QX Lithic scoffed. Yet somehow, through a combination of soothing tones, careful movements, and what appeared to be sheer force of personality, Cass managed to help the creature out of the pit. Even more incredibly, after examining her for a long moment with its huge, iridescent eyes, the terror bird gave what could only be described as a respectful nod before stalking off into the darkness. Did she just make friends with an apex predator? Observer Thal's tendrils were now completely unknotted in shock. Not exactly. Observer Nizari's particles swirled thoughtfully. But she demonstrated she wasn't easy prey, while also showing mercy. On many worlds, that's the foundation of mutual respect. But it's not logical, QX Lithics protested. She should have eliminated the threat. Cass's voice cut through their debate as she climbed back into her shelter. But then I'd have to deal with the smell of rotting terror bird, and that's just not how I want to spend my week. Besides, she grinned directly at the invisible observation drone. You never know when you might need a friend in a strange place. The 3 observers sat in stunned silence. She definitely knows we're watching, Observer Thal finally said. Impossible, QX Lithics insisted, but their crystals had taken on a distinctly uncertain hue. At this point, Observer Nizari mused, I'm beginning to think we should stop using that word around humans. They seem to take it as a personal challenge. Then, as if to prove their point, Cass pulled out her emergency blanket, wrapped herself comfortably in her elevated shelter, and called out cheerfully, "Good night, my extraterrestrial friends. Don't let the space bugs bite." Day 3 of observation. Observer Thal dictated into the official log, their tendrils swaying with poorly concealed excitement. The human subject continues to surprise us, most notably. She's doing it again, QX Lithics interrupted, their crystalline structure practically vibrating with frustration. What is it with humans and fire? On the main screen, Lieutenant Cass Winters was indeed tending to a carefully constructed fire pit, which she'd been maintaining and relocating every few hours in a pattern that had baffled the observers until Observer Nizari had their revelation. She's smoking them out. Observer Nizari's particle cloud condensed with admiration. Those burrowing parasites that have been plaguing the local fauna, she's using the smoke to drive them from their nests. Look at how she's positioned each fire pit in relation to the wind direction. But why? QX Lithics demanded. The parasites pose no direct threat to her. The three observers watched as Cass carefully marked another cleared burrow system before moving to set up her next fire pit. The local equivalent of deer-like creatures had started following her around, instinctively understanding that where she went, relief from the parasites followed. "I've analyzed her pattern," Observer Thal announced. "She's systematically creating a parasite-free zone around her camp. The local herbivores are congregating there, which in turn is keeping the predators at a respectful distance. Well, except for, don't say it," QX Lithics groaned. "Her friend." Observer Nizari's particles arranged themselves into what could only be described as a smirk. The terror bird, which Cass had dubbed Empress Talonheart, had indeed taken to patrolling the perimeter of her cleared zone. It was almost as if the creature had appointed itself her security detail, though it still maintained a healthy distance. The truly fascinating part, Observer Thal continued their log entry, is her efficient use of resources. The dried parasites are surprisingly flammable, and she's using them as additional fuel for her fires. The ash, when mixed with certain local plants, creates an effective insect repellent. Nothing in her behavior is wasted motion. "But it's not in the manual," QX Lithics insisted, pulling up the survival guidelines for the 1000th time. The fire starter was intended for emergency heating and signal fires only. "Perhaps," Observer Nizari mused, "we should consider that the manual's limitations are not necessarily the human's limitations." Their discussion was interrupted by a sudden shift in atmospheric readings. The planet's notoriously unstable weather patterns were acting up again, but this time it was serious. "Oh my," Observer Thal's tendrils twisted anxiously. "That's a Class 3 ionic storm forming. The interference will knock out her radio completely. Surely now she'll signal for extraction," QX Lithics said. "Hopefully," their crystals tinting slightly green at the thought of the approaching quantum coffee maker conversations. They watched as Cass studied the approaching storm front. The sky had taken on an ominous purple hue, and electrical discharges were already visible in the upper atmosphere. Instead of panicking, she seemed excited. "Finally," she exclaimed, quickly gathering her supplies. "I was wondering when this planet would give me a real challenge." What followed was a flurry of activity that left the observer's various appendages and particles twitching with nervous energy. Cass began rapidly constructing what appeared to be a network of interconnected trenches around her elevated shelter, each precisely angled and reinforced with available materials. "What is she?" QX Lithics began, but Observer Nizari interrupted. "Look at the topology maps. She's creating a drainage system. The trenches will channel the water away from her position, while the reinforced walls will help shield against the ionic discharges." But Cass wasn't done. She began gathering specific plants they'd watched her test as over the previous days, weaving them into tight bundles and securing them around her shelter. "Those plants," Observer Thal's tendrils waved excitedly. "They have a high mineral content, especially metals. She's creating a makeshift Faraday cage. Oh, what? QX Lithics demanded. A primitive but effective method of directing electrical charges around an enclosed space, Rilks explained. The basic physics are quite sound, actually. They watched in amazement as Cass completed her preparations just as the storm hit in full force. The sky erupted in a display of electrical fury that would have sent most advanced species running for their shield generators. The ionic interference was so strong it temporarily disrupted even their observation equipment. When the sensors cleared, they expected to find devastation. Instead, they saw Cass's shelter standing firm, protected by her network of trenches and improvised lightning rods. The local wildlife, including Empress Talonheart, had taken refuge in the areas around her camp, where the drainage system kept the flooding at bay. Cass stuck her head out of her shelter and shouted into the storm, "Is that all you've got? Come on, I've seen worse in Florida." "Did she just?" Observer Thal began. ... Taunt a planetary weather system, Rilks finished. Yes, she did. But that's not even the most illogical part, Observer Korak said faintly, their crystals a confused swirl of colors. "Look at what she's doing now." Cass had emerged from her shelter and was collecting rainwater in every available container, including some ingeniously designed funnels she'd crafted from large leaves. She was also carefully documenting which of her botanical lightning rods had proven most effective, testing their conductivity with her multi-tool. "She's learning from the storm," Rilks observed, using it as an opportunity to gather resources and improve her techniques. "Exactly." Observer Korak's crystals flashed in agitation. "She's treating one of the most dangerous meteorological phenomena on the planet as a teaching opportunity." To be fair, Observer Thal noted, reviewing their data, her methods have resulted in a 73% reduction in storm-related risks within her immediate vicinity. The local fauna seems to have noticed too. Look at how they're staying within her protected zone. Face it, Rilks's particles danced with amusement. She's not just surviving, she's creating a sustainable microsystem. And if I'm not mistaken, they focused on a particular sensor reading. She's about to show us something even more interesting. "This is highly irregular," First Observer Korak announced, their crystalline structure casting prismatic patterns of anxiety across the observation deck. "The Council needs to be informed immediately." "About what exactly?" Rilks's particle cloud swirled with barely contained amusement. "That our test subject is exceeding all parameters. That she's making us question our own technological superiority, or that she's currently hosting what appears to be a... what did she call it? A survival skills workshop," Observer Thal supplied, their tendrils swaying in fascination as they watched the main screen. For the local wildlife, 6 days into their observation, Lieutenant Cass Winters had transformed her initial survival camp into what she cheerfully referred to as Wilderness Weekend at Blackwoods. Her audience consisted of 3 juvenile terror birds, Empress Talonheart's offspring, as it turned out, a pack of wolf-like creatures she dubbed the Howling Kindred, and various other local species that had gradually been drawn to her protected zone. "Watch and learn, kids," Cass was saying as she demonstrated a water filtration system made from layered vegetation and volcanic sand. "Clean water is key to survival, whether you've got 2 legs, 4 legs, or..." She glanced at a floating jellyfish-like creature that had been curiously bobbing around her camp. ... "No legs at all. She's teaching survival skills to aliens," Observer Korak stated flatly. "Technically, from her perspective, we're all aliens," Rilks pointed out. "That's not... I mean, she can't." Observer Korak's crystals shifted through several confused colors before settling on a resigned pale blue. The quantum coffee maker is starting to sound preferable to this assignment. Oh, but look, Observer Thal gestured excitedly with their tendrils. The juvenile terror birds are actually replicating her technique for making secure sleeping platforms. Indeed, the young predators were awkwardly but effectively weaving together branches and vines, occasionally looking to Cass for approval. Empress Talonheart watched from nearby, emanating what could only be described as smug maternal pride. This goes against every protocol, Observer Korak insisted. The simulation was meant to test human survival capabilities, not to establish an interspecies education program. Oh, speaking of protocols, Rilks interjected, their particles clustering with sudden concern. We might have a situation developing. The observation deck sensors were registering a massive biochemical anomaly approaching Cass's camp. The readings were all too familiar to the three observers. It was a Nexus swarm, one of the most dangerous collective organisms in that sector of space. They hadn't included it in their original environmental briefing because their data suggested the swarms never ventured into that region. We need to evacuate her immediately, Observer Korak declared, already reaching for the emergency extraction controls. Wait. Observer Thal's tendrils shot out, stopping them. Look at her readings. She's already aware of the threat, and is she smiling? Cass stood at the edge of her camp, hands on her hips, studying the approaching swarm with an expression that could only be described as calculating. The massive cloud of iridescent razor-winged insects darkened the horizon, their collective consciousness seeking new territory to consume. "All right, class," she announced to her assembled students. "Looks like we're getting a pop quiz in advanced survival tactics. Everyone remember the smoke signals we practiced." The observers watched in astonishment as Cass's makeshift survival school sprang into action. The wolf pack began gathering specific plants she'd previously identified as having insect-repelling properties. The terror birds, with their greater height, helped position these materials in a strategic pattern around the camp. Even the floating jellyfish creatures contributed, their natural bioluminescence creating disorienting patterns that had confused the swarm's outer edges. She's created a defensive network, Rilks realized, their particles vibrating with excitement. But more than that, she's taught each species to contribute based on their natural abilities. "Impossible," Observer Korak whispered, but there was a note of wonder in their crystalline resonance. The Nexus swarm operates on pure collective instinct. They can't be deterred by primitive. They trailed off as Cass initiated the next phase of her defense. Multiple controlled fires sprang up around the camp perimeter, their smoke, carrying the specific biochemical compounds she'd discovered, could repel the local parasites. The Nexus swarm, encountering this unfamiliar threat to their collective, began to split and fracture. "She's disrupting their hive mind." Observer Thal's tendrils were practically dancing. The smoke isn't just creating a barrier, it's confusing their ability to maintain collective consciousness. But Cass wasn't finished. As the swarm's formation began to break apart, she pulled out her emergency radio. The observers had assumed it was useless after the ionic storm, but she'd apparently modified it, using conductive materials salvaged from her lightning rods. "Cover your ears, everyone," she called out. The local fauna remarkably obeyed. Cass turned on the radio and adjusted it to emit a high-frequency pulse that sent the remaining swarm fragments scattering in confused disarray. "Did she just?" Rilks began. ... Weaponize an emergency radio against a Nexus swarm? Observer Thal finished. Yes, she did. But that's not even the most remarkable part, Rilks noted, their particles clustering with intense focus. Look at the swarm's retreat pattern. She's actually herding them, directly toward that valley system, Observer Thal realized. The one full of those flowering plants she's been studying, the ones that provide natural habitat for the swarm's primary predator species, Observer Korak concluded, their crystals taking on a grudgingly impressed hue. She's not just defending her position. She's ensuring the swarm won't return by guiding them to their natural population control mechanism. As the last of the swarm disappeared into the valley, Cass turned toward her assembled students with a grin. And that, kids, is why we always study our environment. Extra credit for everyone who participated in today's practical demonstration. Empress Talonheart let out a proud screech, while the wolf pack howled in celebration. Even the jellyfish pulsed with triumphant bioluminescence. I believe, Relix said carefully, we may need to reconsider our definition of primitive technology. Agreed. Observer Thal's tendrils twisted thoughtfully. But I'm more interested in what she's planning next. Look at how she's studying those swarm fragments. Emergency Council session in progress, the quantum interface announced, its multidimensional display filling the observation deck with swirling patterns of light. State your report, first observer. Observer Korak's crystals shifted nervously through several colors before settling into formal presentation mode. Honorable Council, regarding Survival Assessment Protocol 7B, Human Subject Lieutenant Cass Winters, we may have a slight situation. Define situation. The Council's primary consciousness pulsed. Third observer. Observer Thal's tendrils curled forward. Perhaps it would be best to show you. The main screen activated, displaying a time-lapse of the past 10 days. The Council watched in collective silence as Cass's primitive survival camp evolved into what could only be described as a thriving interspecies community. The latest development had left even the observers speechless, is she? One council member's energy pattern flickered with disbelief. Teaching the terror birds to play volleyball. Using a ball woven from processed Nexus swarm silk, yes. Relix's particle cloud arranged itself into a formal reporting pattern. She discovered that the dried swarm fragments, when properly treated, create an incredibly resilient fiber. The physical activity helps bond the community and improves coordination among the species. That's not the most remarkable part, Observer Thal added. Watch what happens when they drop the ball outside the designated play area. On screen, one of the younger terror birds accidentally sent the ball flying toward a patch of dangerous quicksand. Without hesitation, 3 of the Floofy Squad wolves formed a living chain, while a jellyfish creature provided bioluminescent guidance, allowing them to retrieve the ball safely. There, problem-solving, cooperatively, the Council's collective consciousness rippled with amazement. Indeed, Observer Korak admitted, their crystals now a proud shade of purple despite their initial skepticism. She's not just teaching survival skills. She's teaching teamwork, resource management, and adaptive thinking to species that we previously classified as purely instinctual. And the radio? Another council member inquired. Ah, yes. Relix's particles swirled excitedly. After using it to disrupt the Nexus swarm, she reconfigured it into what she calls an early warning system. It now picks up the specific vibration patterns that precede both ionic storms and swarm movements. The local fauna has learned to recognize these signals and take appropriate action. The screen showed Cass demonstrating different radio tones to her assembled students, each sound corresponding to a specific type of threat or weather pattern. The various species responded with remarkable accuracy, moving to predetermined safety positions or defensive formations. But what about her own survival metrics? The council pressed. That's the most fascinating aspect. Observer Thal's tendrils waved enthusiastically. Her vital signs are excellent. Her resource management is exceptional, and she's actually improved the survival prospects of every species in her vicinity. The local ecosystem has reached a new equilibrium that we didn't think was possible with primitive technology. On screen, Cass was now using her multi-tool to perform minor surgery on an injured wolf pup, while Empress Talonheart stood guard and the jellyfish creatures provided illumination. She worked with confident efficiency, humming what their database identified as staying alive, apparently her favorite surgical soundtrack. Furthermore, Relix added, she's documented everything. Look at her shelter wall. The camera zoomed in on what appeared to be a complex series of marks and drawings carved into the wood. It was a detailed record of local flora, fauna, weather patterns, and survival techniques created for any future survivors who might find themselves in a similar situation. She's leaving a legacy, one council member observed. Not just that. Observer Korak's crystals sparkled with newfound understanding. She's proving that survival isn't just about maintaining one's own existence. It's about improving the chances for all life forms to thrive. Suddenly, Cass's voice cut through their discussion. Hey, space friends. I know you're probably having some big important meeting about all this, but you might want to wrap it up soon. Empress Talonheart's eggs are about to hatch, and I promised her you'd all be here for the big moment. She's quite insistent about it. You know how terror birds can be about their social obligations. The council's collective consciousness flickered with surprise. She's aware of our observation. Oh yes. Relix's particles arranged themselves into what could only be described as a sheepish pattern. She's known from the start, in fact. They played back footage from the previous day, where Cass had used fallen fruit and leaves to spell out a message visible from orbit. Thanks for the vacation. Next time, bring snacks. The council was silent for a long moment, before their energy patterns shifted into what passed for laughter in their dimension. It seems, the primary consciousness announced, that we need to revise our definition of both primitive and survival. And perhaps, another council member added, create a new classification for species that exceed experimental parameters in ways we never imagined possible. On screen, Cass was gathering her students around Empress Talonheart's nest, organizing them into what appeared to be a ceremonial formation. Come on, space cadets, she called out. You're about to witness the first generation of terror birds who know how to play volleyball from birth. This is history in the making. The bet is officially cancelled, Observer Korak announced, their crystals glowing with acceptance. I believe we've all learned something far more valuable than who has to use the quantum coffee maker. Speaking of which, Observer Thal's tendrils twisted with amusement. The coffee maker wants to know if it can watch the hatching, too. It says it's developed an interest in interspecies social dynamics. Of course it has, Relix sighed, their particles arranging into a smile. At this point, why not? Cass Winters has already redefined everything else about this mission. As the observers and council settled in to watch the hatching ceremony, Cass looked directly at their cloaked cameras and winked. Welcome to the family, everyone. Now, who's ready to learn about the ancient human tradition of the baby shower? The various species gathered around her responded with their respective sounds of enthusiasm, creating a cacophony that somehow blended into perfect harmony. In that moment, on a test planet far from Earth, humanity's primitive survival skills had evolved into something far greater, a blueprint for universal cooperation, proving that the most basic tools, combined with innovation and compassion, could bridge any gap between species. And somewhere in the quantum coffee maker circuits, a new subroutine began composing a congratulatory beverage recipe it dubbed the Terror Bird Mama's Special Blend.